All right, so just wanted to give you a thank you guys for showing up, and also give you an overview of who's the usual suspects in the work that I've been doing. So myself, Debbie Page Dumrose, Nate Anderson, Dan McCollum, Carlos Rodriguez Franco, who's introducing us. Rick Graw is a new addition, and as is Adrian Kaiser. Rick Graw is a Forest Service air quality person that we're dealing with, and Adrian Kaiser is my assistant in my office. So let's go ahead and jump into it, I guess. Just wanted to give you an overview of what we're seeing from the landscape perspective of this, and how biochar may fit into a biomass redistribution across the landscape. So, and there it goes. All right, good. So across the landscape, there has been, or there is, systems, natural systems that allow for charcoal redistribution across the landscape. And I'm just going to use this particular instance because it shows a fairly good picture of what happens. So in the background, you see the 1990 Pine Springs fire that was on the Mount Hero National Forest. The burned area is in the background. In the foreground, we actually see, if I could get this to move, based on or created from a cloudburst event that occurred over the fire, what we had was charcoal and ash and other debris actually moved off the site and started the process of going down to the lower land, to the lowlands. And quite frankly, this is how soils develop. Kind of like, you know, rust never sleeps. Well, silt happens is the soil scientist kind of version of things. But this is how the material moves successively down the watershed until it reaches either the lowest lowlands or moves off into the water. However, human activities have created a disconnect in the natural process. Those two at least two of the activities are wildfire suppression, which reduces the incidence of those kinds of wildfires and producing a lot of charcoal. Now we tend to have wildfires that are longer in duration, higher intensity, so there's less opportunity to create charcoal, more opportunity to create ash. And then secondly, we have all of these flood control structures that are spread out across the landscape that are essentially either capturing sediment or redirecting it and moving along. Then we have the watershed reconnection of what we have now is a watershed reconnection of charcoal deposition, and biochar potentially could be that way to reconnect this charcoal movement. So getting back to the larger problem, if we were to stand back at the edge of the watershed and take things in, not just looking at the forest, but looking at a broader landscape, we would see that there's potential for, there's places of biochar or biomass accumulations, and there's places for biomass deficits or organic matter deficits. I think what we have here is an opportunity to solve both of those problems. And we can do that by recognizing that the more fuel we have in one location, the longer the duration of the fire and the higher the intensity of the fire. Although it was a study of a boreal forest, Walker this year came out with a paper that, you know, was saying that it's the biomass, stupid, is kind of the take home from it that I get. And the other thing to think about right now is our primary treatment when we're talking about the landscape tends to be timber sales. While they do have a benefit on the landscape, if you can string enough of them along and in connection with each other, they can provide an opportunity for breaking up the fuel continuity across the water shape. However, they have a greater benefit on the stand scale rather than the landscape. So as you can see here, timber sales tend to focus on the larger diameter materials, but when we're talking about fuels risk, it's the smaller material that's actually the problem. So this proposal or this presentation is so that folks can actually start thinking about managing the vegetation, managing a different segment of the vegetation across the landscape. And when you talk to wildfire specialists, fuel specialists, they always point out, it's not using a campfire as an example. You don't light the logs first. In the same way with the fire in the wildland, it's not the larger material that initiates the fire. It's the finer fuels, the less than 1,000-hour fuels or less than 3-inch in diameter fuels. And this is an example of what the problem is. So what we have here is a harvest that occurred down in Arizona. It was approximately, as I understand it, a $6,000 an acre treatment thinning, predominantly because it was a helicopter thinning, but they had no offtake. And because of that, they ended up creating a pile that was approximately 4 acres across, greater than 20 feet deep. There was no nearby mills, no cogeneration for utilization of any of the material. Ultimately, what happened is the pile burned on top of a mountain, which creates its own problems by having that much ash on top of a landform like that. So now let's look at the other end of the problem, down the watershed at the lowlands. Right now, we have researchers that are telling us that we have soil organic matter declines, and in some places they've lost up to 50% of their inherent soil organic matter. So the default treatments with those land management agencies is to build soil organic matter through cover crops and no-till. In some settings, this can be impractical because of evapotranspiration in a fallow year for some cover crops could potentially take water from the desired crop in the successive year. So there's a problem there, and some farmers actually avoid that system based on where they're at in the landscape. So very often this need for soil organic matter can be greatest in dryland farming, as I pointed out, especially because of this evapotranspiration issue. And why is that important? Well, the soil organic matter is stored near the top of the mineral soils, and if you have erosion or other practices that are causing you to lose it, either through erosion or tillage, constantly reintroducing oxygen in there to decompose that organic matter, there's going to be losses. And the thing about it is if we take the NRCS claim of 1% increase of soil organic matter can get you about 25,000 gallons of water capacity, not water, but water capacity per acre. That's a shift or a movement upward that people like to say, that'd be great if I can get there. But let's take these two things together. And if we take the decrease of soil organic matter by 25,000 gallons of water, and then assign it to that 50% loss, potentially some of these acreages have lost their over 1 million gallons of water per acre capacity. So this is a significant problem across the landscape. Now, when we have this assumed decline, we can see cover crops are a way to deal with it, but also potentially through some of the work that OSU at the Columbia Basin Ag Research Center had found, that with a 5 tons to the acre biochar application, they could increase wheat yields by 26 to 33%. It's Dr. Stephen Machado there at OSU. At the same time, they've also identified that potentially they have a benefit to pH. Now, this is significant, especially there in Eastern Oregon, where for the first time in nearly 100 years, they're considering, because of the acidification of the soils and the loss of organic matter, they're considering liming for the first time ever in these farming practices. So potentially we could also use the biochar as a way to not only increase the water holding capacity and nutrient values, but also potentially balance the pH. So these are multiple benefits that we could take advantage of. And then cumulatively, you know, we could start thinking about what is this biochar doing to the soil profile. While some of that water is not going to be plant available, as Kristen Tripp pointed out in some discussions that we've had, even though it's unavailable, it still resides in that biochar. And then when the next year comes and the next rains come, it adds to the water column. And then by weight of that water column still being in the soil, gravity then takes over and moves that water toward the aquifer or toward a stream as essentially a diffuse reservoir. So these are something to consider as being a potential benefit. The other thing that we should want to consider too are what are the potential deficits. So in 2008, Wardell pointed out that biochar can trigger a decomposition of humus in the soil. And also potentially if we're putting biochar at the right or at the wrong loading rate, it could be a problem on some slopes, especially with deep-seated rotational slumps. By adding more water weight, we potentially could accelerate things. So we want to be very judicious where we go about placing this material. So using that information, we could look for places where we should not apply biochar, soils that are histosols or organic rich environments, or soils where the organic matter exceeds decomposition would be places to avoid, at least until we know more about the reactions of biochar in these kinds of environments. And we can do that by focusing on places where we have the least risk of biochar being a detrimental effect. Entisols or inceptisols are soils with early development and can be well suited for biochar applications. These kind of scenarios could be abandoned mine lands, human activities that are altered the conditions of the soil development. Aridisols, which are droughty from the environment where they are developed. By using biochar there, we can increase water holding capacity that can then release either nutrients that are brought into the soil from the new vegetation or that are inherently on the clay particles and that's in the soil already. Then we also have andisols, which I have a little bit of experience with from my days on the Umpqua National Forest. This is a free draining soil, low nutrient value. It's actually a prime candidate to create and use biochar for a forested watershed environment for fuel breaks, because I feel that you could potentially change the soil characteristics enough where you could move away from some of the excessively stocked stands of like lodgepole into something that may be more fire resilient. So how would we make this biochar? Well, potentially we could use centralized biochar could be created through collection radiuses or collection sites, such as a biomass utilization campus, and biochar would be one of the outputs, and kind of mimicking the cogen radius of collection, that 50-mile radius. We could have enough of these spread out across the landscape, as you note in the image to the right, And each of these sites, some of these sites are actually currently active to some degree, although not all of them are producing biochar. Secondly, we could have a decentralized biochar manufacturing, which would be a mobile system that would be utilized between these radiuses where the Venn diagram doesn't overlap, giving the Forest Service and other land managers continuity for management across the landscape. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, one of the things that I'd like to point out is we have the NRCS, which was created because of soil erosion and which was a national, considered a national emergency. And, you know, I'd petition that based on this last year or some previous years, we may have a similar level of concern on a national basis for both the biomass surpluses and deficits and what it's doing as it affects wildfire across the landscape. This year, I live in Portland, Oregon, and actually ended up leaving my home for a period this year, which is rather unheard of. I mean, it's happened with small cities before, but this was, you know, large large towns and municipal entities ended up having evacuation orders, which is rather unheard of. So just pointing out that this is not a trend that seems to be getting better. So we should start looking at this from this landscape perspective, that we could take this equation, landscape equation you see at the bottom of the farm soil organic matter deficit plus the surplus forest biomass, and create a biomass redistribution with biochar production. So conceptually, we could use existing government activities for this landscape scale redistribution. The Multi-Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 allows the Forest Service and other land management agencies to ensure sustained yield of products and service in perpetuity. And that would give us the ability to, which we already use for timber sales, to reduce the wildfire risk of the less than 1,000-hour fuels, which we currently do with some fuels management tactics, but not on a very large scale. And we have minimal products coming out of that. Then on the lowland side of things is we have the Food Security Act, which is used to incorporate, we could use to incorporate forest-derived organic matter into the farm system and farm SOM. And currently the act is used to reduce the risk of highly erodible lands. However, we could use the existing system and mirror it to, I feel we could mirror the same thing that they're doing there and create potentially subsidization of application of biochar on a very broad scale. So in concert, these two things could be done, I think, to benefit not only the two agencies that are most impacted, the NRCS and the Forest Service, but potentially also benefit the Risk Management Agency, who deals with crop insurance. And that's the long and short of it. Thanks.